In a small town nestled between rolling hills where the air was thick with old traditions and unspoken rules, a young black teenager named Elijah found himself caught in a storm of racial injustice that he couldn't escape no matter how hard he tried. It all began the day he was accused of a crime he didn't commit. The town was known for its close-knit community, but its deep-rooted prejudices were never far from the surface. Elijah had always tried to stay out of trouble, keeping his head down and focusing on his studies, but that all changed the day he became the target of a crime he knew nothing about. When a robbery occurred at the local convenience store, and the police quickly arrested him based on a flimsy eyewitness account from a white woman who had misidentified him as the suspect. Elijah was confused, angry, and scared. He had never been in trouble with the law before, and suddenly he was being treated like a criminal. The town buzzed with rumors and whispers behind his back. Elijah's name was now tainted, and the judge assigned to his case was none other than Judge Charles Thompson, a man who had spent decades on the bench, known for his tough sentencing and his conservative views. Judge Thompson had a reputation for being fair, but Elijah knew nothing of the deep-seated biases that colored his decisions. Not until it was too late. The trial was a blur of faces, voices, and accusations. But the one thing that stood out to Elijah was the judge's cold demeanor. From the moment he stepped into the courtroom, Judge Thompson made it clear that he had already made up his mind. Elijah's lawyer tried to argue that the evidence was insufficient, but it didn't matter. The judge was unmoved and uninterested in hearing the facts. The town's racial divide had grown wider over the years, but it wasn't until Elijah stood before the judge that he realized just how deep the wound ran. Judge Thompson didn't even try to hide his prejudice. The way he looked at Elijah was enough to make him feel like an outsider in his own home. The judge's decision was swift and harsh. Elijah was sentenced to 10 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. The courtroom fell silent as the gavel came down, and Elijah's world shattered. His family was devastated. His mother cried out in disbelief. His father clenched his fists and vowed to fight for justice. But the weight of the judge's words was unyielding, and Elijah was led away in handcuffs to a fate that seemed inevitable. As the prison doors closed behind him, he felt a crushing sense of hopelessness. The world had turned its back on him, and the man who held his fate in his hands had done so without ever seeing him as a person, without seeing his innocence, only the color of his skin. Elijah spent his first night in prison staring at the cold cement walls and wondering how his life had gone so horribly wrong. The memories of the trial haunted him, the injustice, the disbelief. The way Judge Thompson's eyes had never met his, but instead looked through him as if he was less than human. The years ahead seemed long and unforgiving, but Elijah was determined to hold on to the one thing that hadn't been taken from him, his belief that one day the truth would come out and the man who had condemned him would finally be held accountable for the wrong he had done. Elijah's family refused to accept the judge's verdict. They weren't going to let him rot in prison without a fight. His mother, Sarah, was a pillar of strength. Her voice was heard at every rally and protest. She could muster the courage to speak even when the weight of the injustice nearly crushed her. Father, Raymond, was less vocal, but no less determined. He dug through every legal document and hired every lawyer he could find to help prove Elijah's innocence. No stone was left unturned. They knew they were up against the full force of the system, but they believed that the truth was undeniable and that eventually justice would prevail. The town watched in divided silence. Some rallied behind Elijah's family, while others rallied behind Judge Thompson, who had served the community faithfully for decades. No one was willing to admit that a man so respected could have made such a grievous mistake. The more Elijah's family fought, the more the lines between the two sides grew entrenched. Every victory felt small as they battled against a sea of indifference and skepticism. But Sarah refused to back down. She kept pushing forward as if her son's life depended on it, because it did. The legal system wasn't kind to Elijah, and every hearing seemed like a dead end. The judge's influence stretched far beyond the courtroom, and his allies were many, but his family remained resolute. They gathered new evidence and found witnesses who had seen Elijah miles away from the scene of the crime. But even with this new information, the judge seemed immune to their efforts. The months stretched into years. With each passing day, Elijah's hope of freedom seemed more and more distant. The prison walls felt thicker, and the distance between him and his family felt wider. But they never stopped fighting, not for 1 second. In the midst of the pain, Elijah started to learn about the judge who had condemned him. He learned about Judge Thompson's history, his reputation in the town, and the way he had built his career on a foundation of authority and unquestioned power. But as the years passed, something within the judge started to change. He had spent so long sitting behind his bench, delivering verdicts without consequence, that he had lost sight of the humanity in the cases he presided over, and now, with every report he heard about Elijah's case, he began to wonder if he had made a grave mistake, a mistake. He couldn't erase a mistake that weighed heavily on his conscience, but it was too late to take it back. Elijah's name had already been dragged through the mud, and the stain of a wrongful conviction was hard to remove. The town was divided and tensions rose as people took sides. Some supported Elijah's innocence, while others believed in the judge's infallibility. The community's unity shattered into pieces, and the conflict seemed impossible to resolve. Meanwhile, the judge began to question the foundation of his own decisions, and the town that had once revered him began to shift ever so slightly. But in his heart he knew the truth, even if it was a truth he couldn't bring himself to admit. Yet every night, as Elijah lay in his cell, he thought about the world outside and whether he would ever see it again. The years had hardened him, but he never lost sight of one thing: the fight for justice was bigger than him. It was a fight that would echo far beyond his prison walls, and maybe, just maybe, one day the truth would come to light. As the years passed, Elijah's case slowly began to fade from the front pages of the local papers. The town had moved on, as if time could erase the injustice that had occurred, and yet the scars remained deep in the hearts of those who had fought for him. His family never gave up, but with each passing day it became harder to keep the flame of hope alive. The legal battles were long and drawn out, with no end in sight. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and in the meantime Elijah's life continued to be consumed by the cold steel bars of the prison. His body aged faster than his soul, but his resolve remained firm. He knew that if he couldn't be the one to free himself, his family would do whatever it took to prove his innocence. But even they began to feel the crushing weight of time. The fight for Elijah had become a constant battle against a system that seemed indifferent to his suffering, and every failed attempt to get his case reopened felt like another defeat. But Sarah never stopped fighting. She attended every hearing and wrote letters to anyone who might listen. She made phone calls and knocked on doors, looking for any ally who might help her find the truth. She became known not just as a mother, but as a tireless advocate for her son's freedom. She was no longer just a victim of injustice. She was a force to be reckoned with. Raymond, too, did everything in his power to support his wife and son. He knew how important it was to keep their fight alive, even if it meant sacrificing his own well-being. They both put their lives on hold for a cause greater than themselves, and yet they continued to face setbacks. No matter how many lawyers they hired, no matter how much evidence they found, the judge's power remained unshaken in the town, where people still revered him. His word was law, and even the most compelling evidence seemed to fall on deaf ears. But in the quiet corners of the town, whispers began to spread about the truth of Elijah's case. There were those who began to question Judge Thompson's integrity and whether he had allowed his personal biases to blind him to the reality of the case. They began to dig into his past, searching for any evidence of corruption or wrongdoing. They knew it would be a long shot, but the seeds of doubt had been planted even among those who had once idolized him. Slowly but surely the truth began to crack through the thick walls of silence that had been built around Elijah's case. People who had once been silent began to speak up, and as the town divided more sharply into two camps, those who believed in Elijah's innocence and those who refused to believe that Judge Thompson could have made such a mistake, the cracks in the judge's reputation began to widen. He had spent years dismissing the mounting evidence against his decision, but now the pressure was growing, and it was starting to become harder to ignore the whispers of guilt that were spreading throughout the town. Even Judge Thompson couldn't silence them forever, and yet he remained adamant that he had made the right call. Despite everything, despite the evidence, despite the growing discontent, his mind was locked in place by the same prejudice that had led him to make that fateful decision years ago. Elijah had long stopped hoping for any kind of miracle. He had resigned himself to the idea that his life would be defined by his wrongful conviction. But as his family continued to fight on, something began to stir deep within him, a sense of determination that hadn't been there before. Perhaps this time it would be different. Perhaps this time the truth would finally find its way to the surface. Judge Thompson's daughter, Emily, had always lived a life of privilege. She grew up in the comfortable bubble of her father's success and authority. The town admired him, and she admired him too. She was proud to be his daughter. Her father's word was law in their house, just as it was in the courtroom, and she believed that his wisdom and experience were beyond reproach. As a young woman, Emily followed in her father's footsteps, by attending an Ivy League university where she excelled academically and socially. She was the picture of success to everyone who knew her, but behind the polished exterior, she carried a heavy burden. She had never fully questioned the role her father played in the town's power structure. She accepted his decisions as fact because she had never known anything different. It wasn't until her final year of university that she first started to hear murmurs about her father's role in Elijah's case. At first, the whispers were easy to dismiss. They came from the margins of her life, the voices of classmates who studied social justice or activists who frequented protests in the city. But something about their words began to echo in her mind. She'd never considered the possibility that her father might be wrong, and the thought gnawed at her. She returned home for the summer and began to notice subtle changes in the way people treated her. Whispers followed her in the grocery store and the coffee shop, and even at family gatherings. Some looked at her with pity, others with disdain. It wasn't until a former classmate from high school approached her one afternoon that the full weight of her father's actions hit her. The young man was someone she had once known as a friend. His name was Marcus, and his younger brother had been one of the boys who had known Elijah. The moment Marcus began to speak, Emily's heart sank as he recounted the events of that day, the wrongful arrest, the trial, and the fact that Elijah had been sentenced for a crime he didn't commit. He spoke with such emotion and conviction that Emily could no longer ignore the truth she had buried deep within her. The realization hit her like a wave. Her father had been responsible for ruining Elijah's life, and she had been too blind to see it. She was crushed by guilt, not just for Elijah, but for her own ignorance. She had lived in a bubble protected from the harsh realities of the world. She had never questioned her father's decisions or his views on race and justice, and now she was faced with the painful truth that her father's actions had caused immense harm. Emily couldn't sleep that night. The guilt and confusion overwhelmed her, and she felt the weight of the truth settle deep within her. How could she have been so blind? How could she have stood by while her father had condemned an innocent man to prison? She spent the next few days reading every article she could find about Elijah's case and the growing calls for justice. The more she learned, the more she was horrified. She couldn't shake the images of Elijah behind bars or the memories of her father's smug confidence when he sentenced him. Her mind raced with questions. How had it come to this? How had the man she loved and admired become a part of something so wrong? She was torn between loyalty to her family and the undeniable truth of Elijah's innocence. Emily knew she couldn't stay silent anymore. She had to find a way to make things right, even if it meant going against her father and everything she had ever known. Her world had turned upside down, and she had no idea what the next step would be, but she knew she had to act, even if it meant losing everything she had once believed in. Emily's life began to unravel in ways she never expected. Her days were consumed by the haunting realization that her father had wronged an innocent man, and her nights were filled with guilt and sleeplessness. She could no longer ignore the truth, but confronting it seemed impossible. The man she had always seen as a pillar of strength and wisdom was now a source of deep shame. Her once steadfast belief in his righteousness was shattered. She knew she couldn't keep living in the bubble of denial that had protected her for so long. Emily started to distance herself from her father and the world they had built together. She became a quiet observer of the town's growing discontent over Elijah's case. At first, it was a subtle shift, just murmurs among friends and strangers alike. But soon it became clear that the community was no longer content to let the injustice slide. People were angry, and they weren't going to let it go unnoticed. Every day, more people spoke out against the judge's decision, and they began to demand a retrial for Elijah. They organized protests, wrote letters, and used every resource at their disposal to bring attention to the case. And as the cries for justice grew louder, Emily couldn't help but feel the weight of her complicity. Her father had made his decisions in the courtroom, but she had made her own decisions too, by staying silent, by choosing not to question him. And now she was paying the price. She began to isolate herself from the people she once held dear. The friends who had stood by her side for years began to distance themselves, unsure of how to navigate the growing divide. And Emily found herself caught in the middle. She couldn't deny that she was part of the problem anymore, but she also couldn't find the courage to confront the very source of that problem, her father, the man who had always been her protector, her guide, her everything. Emily spent hours reading through legal documents, trying to piece together the facts of Elijah's case, hoping to find something that might give her the strength to confront her father with the truth. But each piece of information only made the weight heavier. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, But she also knew that if she didn't take action, she would be forever complicit in a system that had broken an innocent boy and destroyed so many lives in the process. She had to find the courage to face her father, to question everything she had believed, to risk everything she had ever known for the sake of justice. But the thought of confronting him was terrifying. Her father had always been unshakable in his beliefs. He had built his life on the foundation of authority and respect, and now she was about to shatter that foundation with the truth. Emily knew that if she spoke out, it would destroy everything: the reputation of the family. She had loved her father's career, his honor, and her own place in the world, but the cost of silence was far worse than the price of speaking out. Her mind raced as she searched for the right words to say, the right way to approach the man she had once admired, the man she now feared and resented. But deep down she knew that there was no easy way to do it. The truth was the truth, and it had to be faced. She spent days rehearsing her conversation in her head, trying to prepare herself for the inevitable moment when she would have to face her father, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure whether she would be able to walk away with her integrity intact. But she knew she couldn't live with herself if she didn't try. She had already lost so much, and now it was time to stand up and take responsibility for the part she had played in the lie that had destroyed so many lives. Emily sat in her room for hours, staring at the floor, her mind racing with the countless things she wanted to say to her father. But every time she tried to form the words, they seemed to slip away into nothingness. The weight of the truth pressed down on her like an unbearable burden, and she knew there was no escaping it anymore. She had to confront him. She had to make him see the damage he had done to an innocent life. But fear gripped her heart. What if he didn't listen? What if he dismissed her? What if he didn't care about the truth? All of those years of admiration and respect for the man she thought she knew now seemed fragile and hollow. She couldn't shake the image of Elijah's face behind bars, the years he had spent in prison for something he didn't do, and all because her father had failed to see him as a person rather than a statistic. The thought of it all made her stomach churn. She had spent so many years pretending that the world worked in neat little boxes, that good and evil were clearly defined, but now everything was blurred, and she didn't know how to navigate the mess her father had created. But deep down, Emily knew there was no turning back. She couldn't unlearn the truth. She couldn't go back to pretending that everything was fine. So after days of hesitation and sleepless nights, she made the decision to confront him. The conversation would be inevitable, and it would change everything. But she couldn't go on living in the shadow of silence anymore. She had to speak out. She waited until the house was quiet. That evening, her father was in his study, going through old case files, and Emily knew this was the moment she had to seize. She walked down the hallway with her heart pounding in her chest. Her father sat there in silence, his face frozen in a mixture of disbelief and stubbornness. Emily could feel the weight of his gaze on her as she stood across from him, waiting for some kind of response, but nothing came for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Emily's heart pounded louder with every passing second. The air between them felt thick and heavy, and she could see him struggling with her words, struggling to process what she had just said. After what seemed like forever, he finally spoke, but his voice was tight and strained, as if the words were forced through a clenched throat. "Emily, you don't understand," he began, but she interrupted him before he could continue. "I understand more than you think," she said, her voice steady, even though the emotion swirled inside her. "I've spent years ignoring the truth because I didn't want to believe that my father could do something wrong, but I can't ignore it anymore." She could see his eyes harden just a little, as if he was bracing himself for a fight, but Emily refused to back down. This was the moment she had to confront him, no matter the cost. "Elijah is innocent, and you ruined his life," she said again, but this time the words didn't feel as heavy. They felt like a release, a shedding of everything she had kept inside for so long. "You sentenced him because of who he is, not because of what he did." Her father stood up from his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as if holding onto something solid, but his expression shifted from anger to something else, something more vulnerable. "I did what I thought was right," he said, his voice almost pleading. "I thought I was protecting the town. I thought I was doing what was necessary to keep things in order." Emily felt her chest tighten. She had always admired the way her father carried himself, as if his decisions were always made with the greater good in mind. But now she saw that his actions were motivated by fear and prejudice, not justice. "You were wrong," she said softly. "Your fear blinded you to the truth." There was a long silence between them, neither of them sure what to say next. The man who had once been her hero was now standing before her in a way that was almost unrecognizable. She could see the cracks forming in his facade, but he wasn't ready to acknowledge them Yet instead, he took a deep breath and shook his head. "I don't know what you want me to say, Emily." His voice was quieter now, but still tinged with defensiveness. "I can't change what I did." But Emily wasn't backing down. "No, you can't change the past," she said, "but you can try to fix it now." She could see the conflict in his eyes, the reluctance to face the consequences of his actions, but deep inside Emily knew he was starting to understand at least a little. She knew the road to redemption wouldn't be easy, but this was the first step toward acknowledging the truth, and that meant everything. She had to believe that her father could change, even if it seemed impossible right now. She had a hope that the man who had sentenced an innocent boy could still find a way to right his wrongs, even if it meant tearing down everything he had built for himself. But Emily wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't afraid to lose him if it meant standing up for what was right. And in that moment, as she stood in front of him, her heart filled with a quiet sense of strength. The truth had been spoken, and now all they had to do was find a way to make it right. In the days that followed the conversation with her father, Emily felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. The walls that had stood between them for so long had finally cracked, but the truth had not yet fully taken hold of her father. His responses were still tinged with resistance, as if he was caught between the life he had built and the harsh reality of what he had done. Emily didn't know how to fix him or the situation. She just knew that she had to keep pushing for change, even if it meant facing more rejection. But she had also seen a flicker of something in his eyes during their conversation, something that made her believe there was hope, even if it was small. Elijah's family had never stopped fighting, and now the pressure on the judge was mounting from every corner. The public outcry was growing louder each day. More people rallied behind the cause, pushing for the retrial that Elijah deserved. They contacted lawmakers, journalists, and activists, hoping to create enough of a stir to force the court's hand. But the process was slow and exhausting. Each legal hurdle felt like another defeat, but they couldn't stop the momentum that had started to build behind Elijah's name. Sarah and Raymond refused to let go of the dream of seeing their son free. Even if it took everything they pushed on with the help of allies who had joined their cause. Many of them were strangers at first, but they had become like family, bound together by the same belief that justice had to prevail. Elijah himself remained hopeful in his own quiet way. Although the years had hardened him, his resolve had only strengthened. He found small ways to maintain his dignity behind the prison walls, clinging to the hope that someday he would walk free. He would hold on to his family again and be able to rebuild the life that had been stolen from him. While Emily continued her difficult journey at home, her father was beginning to change in small ways. She noticed that his decisions started to shift from a place of authority to a place of reflection. It wasn't immediate, but he was listening more now, paying attention to the voices that had once been drowned out by his own pride and arrogance. And then one day, after weeks of silence and uncertainty, Emily received a call from her father. The voice on the other end was not the same as before. It wasn't filled with defensiveness or fear, but with something closer to resignation and perhaps regret. "Emily," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it before, "I've been looking at everything again, the case, the evidence, the things I didn't see before." He paused for a long moment, and Emily could feel her heart skip a beat as he spoke again. "I made a mistake." His admission was the first step towards redemption, and Emily knew that it wasn't going to be easy, but this was the beginning of the end for the lies that had been built around Elijah's case. Her father had started to see the truth, and she knew that this would be the first of many difficult steps for both of them. They didn't have all the answers, but the journey toward justice was now finally on a path toward resolution, and for the first time in years, Emily could see a glimpse of hope for Elijah's future and the possibility of healing in her family's broken past. It wasn't the end, but it was a start, and that was enough for now.